Bill Sims, interviewed in Ottawa, Kansas, interviewed by Letta Gray, age when interviewed 97. My name is Bill Sims. I was born in Osceola, Missouri, March 16, 1839. I lived on a farm with my mother and my master, whose name was Sims. I had an older sister about 2 years older than I was. My master needed some money, so he sold her, and I have never seen her since, except just a time or two. On the plantation, we raised cows, sheep, cotton, tobacco, corn, which were our principal crops. There was plenty of wild hogs, turkey, and deer, and other game. The deer used to come up and feed with the cattle in the feed yards, and we could get all the wild hogs we wanted by simply shooting them in the timber. A man who owned 10 slaves was considered wealthy, and if he got hard up for money, he would advertise and sell some slaves, like my oldest was sold on the block with her children. She sold for $1,100. A baby in her arms sold for $300. Another sold for $600, and the other for a little less than that. My master was offered $1,500 for me several times, but he refused to sell me because I was considered a good husky slave. My family is all dead, and I am the only one living. The slaves usually lived in 2-room houses made of native lumber. The houses were all small. A 4 or 5-room house was considered a mansion. We made our own clothes, had spinning wheels, and raised and combed our own cotton, clipped the wool from our sheep's backs, combed and spun it into cotton and wool clothes. We never knew what boughten clothes were. I learned to make shoes when I was just a boy, and I made the shoes for the whole family. I used to chop wood and make rails and do all kinds of farm work. I had a good master. Most of the masters were good to their slaves. When a slave got too old to work, they would give him a small cabin in the plantation and have the other slaves to wait on him. They would furnish him with victuals and clothes until he died. Slaves were never allowed to talk to white people other than their masters or someone their masters knew, as they were afraid the white man might have the slave run away. The masters aimed to keep their slaves in ignorance, and the ignorant slaves were all in favor of the rebel army. Only the more intelligent were in favor of the Union Army. When the war started, my master sent me to work for the Confederate Army. I worked most of the time for 3 years off and on, hauling cannons, driving mules, hauling ammunition and provisions. The Union Army pressed in on us, and the rebel army moved back. I was sent home when the Union Army came close enough. I ran away from home and joined the Union Army. There I drove a 6-mule team and worked at wagon work, driving ammunition and all kinds of provisions until the war ended. Then I returned home to my old master, who had stayed there with my mother. My master owned about 400 acres of good land and had 10 slaves. Most of the slaves stayed at home. My master hired me to work for him. He gave my mother 40 acres of land with a cabin on it and sold me 40 acres for $20 when I could pay him. This was timbered land and had lots of good trees for lumber, especially walnut. One tree on this ground was worth $100. If I could only get it cut and marketed, I could pay for my land. My master's wife had been dead for several years. and they had no children, the nearest relative being a nephew. They wanted my master's land and was afraid he would give it all away to us slaves, so they killed him and would have killed us if we had stayed at home. I took my mother and ran into the adjoining Clare County. We settled there and stayed for some time, but I wanted to see Kansas, the state I had heard so much about. I couldn't get nobody to go with me, so I started out afoot across the prairies for Kansas. After I got some distance from home, it was all prairie. I had to walk all day long following Buffalo Trail. At night, I would go off a little ways from the trail and lay down to sleep. In the morning, I'd wake up and could see nothing but the sun and prairie. Not a house, not a tree, no living thing, not even could I hear a bird. I had little to eat. I had a little bread in my pocket. I didn't even have a pocket knife, no weapon of any kind. I was not afraid, but I wouldn't start out that way again. The only shade I could find in the daytime was the rosenweed on the prairie. I would lay down so it would throw the shade in my face and rest, then get up and go again. It was in the spring of the year. In June, I came to Lawrence, Kansas, where I stayed 2 years working on a farm. In 1874, I went to work for a man by the month at $35 a month and made more money than the owner did because the grasshoppers ate up the crops. I was hired to cut up the corn for him, but the grasshoppers ate it up first. He could not pay me for some time. Grasshoppers were so thick you couldn't step on the ground without stepping on about a dozen at each step. I got my money and come to Ottawa in December 1874, about Christmas time. My master's name was Sims, and I was known as Sims Bill, just like horses. When I came out here, I just changed my name from Sims Bill to Bill Sims. Ottawa was very small at the time I came here, and there were several Indians close by that used to come to town. The Indians held their war dance on what is now the courthouse grounds. I planted the trees that are now standing on the courthouse grounds. There were few farms fenced, and what were on the streams. The prairie land was all open. Ottawa didn't have many business houses. There was also an oil mill where they brought castor beans and made castor oil. There was one hotel which was called Lefton House. The people lived pretty primitive. We didn't have kerosene. Our only lights were tallow candles, mostly grease lamps. They were just a pan with grease in it, and one end of the rag dragging out over the side, which we would light. There were no sewers at that time. I had no chance to go to school when a boy. But after I came to Kansas, I was too old to go to school, and I had to work. But I attended night school and learned to read and write and figure. The farmland was nearly all broke up by ox teams, using about 6 oxen on a plow. In Missouri, we lived near the Santa Fe Trail, and the settlers traveling on the trail used oxen, and some of them used cows. The cows seemed to stand the road better than the oxen, and also gave some milk. The travelers usually aimed to reach the prairie states in the spring so they could have grass for their oxen and horses during the summer. I have lived here since I came here. I was married when I was about 30 years old. I married a slave girl from Georgia back in Missouri. If a slave wanted to marry a woman on another plantation, he had to ask the master, and if both masters agreed, they were married. The man stayed at his owner's and the wife at her owner's. He could go to see her on Saturday night and Sunday sometimes, only every 2 weeks. If a man was a big, strong man, neighboring plantation owners would ask him to come over and see his gals, hoping that he might want to marry one of them. But if a Negro was a small man, he was not cared for as a husband, as they valued their slaves as only for what they could do, just like they would horses. When they were married, and if they had children, they belonged to the man who owned the woman. Osceola is where the saying originated. I'm from Missouri, show me. After the war, the smart guys came through and talked the people into voting bonds, but there was no railroad built. Most counties paid their bonds, but the county in which Osceola stands refused to pay for their bonds because there was no railroad built, and they told the collectors to show me the railroad and we will pay. And that is where show me originated from. My wife died when we had 3 children. She had to work hard all her life, and she said she didn't want her children to have to work as hard as she had. And I promised her on her deathbed that I would educate our girls, so I worked and sent the girls to school. My 2 girls both graduated from Ottawa University, the oldest one being the first colored girl to ever graduate from that school. After graduation, she went to teach school in Oklahoma, but only got $25 a month, and I had to work and send her money to pay her expenses. The younger girl also graduated and went to teach school, but she did not teach school long until she married a well-to-do farmer in Oklahoma. The older girl got her wages raised until she got $125 per month. I have worked at farm work and tree husbandry all my life. I have been living alone about 25 years. I don't know how old I was, but my oldest daughter had written my mother before she died and got our family record, which my mother kept in her old Bible. Each year she writes me and tells me on my birthday how old I am.